Bien, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias a todos por venir. Tenemos una muy buena noticia. Acaban de poner el aire acondicionado, con lo cual pues, estamos de enhorabuena. Y estamos de enhorabuena por varias razones. Una es esa, otra es que acaba el ciclo y la otra, la principal, es que acaba de manera inmejorable con la presencia del profesor Branden W, que es, profesor de la Universidad de Columbia, del Departamento de Historia del Arte de la Universidad de Columbia en Nueva York. Ha sido profesor invitado y profesor en otras universidades, como la Universidad de California en Irving, como la Rice University en Texas o la Universidad de Princeton. El profesor Branden W representa quizá la mejor representación de una nueva generación de críticos de arte o de historiadores del arte que vienen a ser la evolución lógica de toda una generación, que es la generación de October, la generación de los Krauss, Foster y Balambois. Perdón. Sus estudios se han caracterizado por adentrarse en el mundo del arte de la última mitad del siglo XX y especialmente en un tipo de arte que está a medio camino entre las artes plásticas, la música, el vídeo, en una especie de terreno de nadie o terreno de todos que resulta ciertamente interesante. La conferencia de hoy sobre Tony Conrad recorre precisamente ese aspecto de tierra de nadie, de esas prácticas experimentales a las que ya le dedicó su tesis doctoral en torno a Cage, Rauschenberg y las prácticas experimentales en los 60, y fruto del cual es también una de las obras más interesantes de las últimas décadas, que es Random Order, en torno a la figura de Robert Rauschenberg. Es un libro que tenéis en el CENDEAC y podéis consultar y que sin duda es la aproximación más lúcida a la obra de este autor, que siempre había sido estudiado desde un punto de vista bastante desde el flanco artístico, bastante historiográfico, y que Joseph intenta acercarse por otros lugares que no son los habituales. Él es también editor y fundador de la revista Grey Room, que también tenéis en el CENDEAC, y que sin lugar a dudas es la sustituta natural, si se puede decir esto, de la revista October. Es el lugar donde con mayor seriedad y mayor cercanía se están abordando ciertos problemas en torno al arte político, en torno a la representación contemporánea, y que, sin duda será una referencia como lo ha sido October. Yo no quiero enrollarme más, simplemente le doy las gracias a él por estar aquí y a vosotros por haber venido, y por lo menos vamos a estar fresquitos. Muchas gracias.
Turn this on? Okay. What I would like to present, or what I'm going to present today, is not so much work in progress as an offshoot of a project that is just coming together or just about to be completed, which is a project investigating art and film and music of the 1960s and 70s from a perspective that I am attempting to develop following up from an idea by the contemporary artist Mike Kelly, which is the notion of a minor history. And that is the attempt to follow and to investigate in a genealogical fashion cultural and artistic developments that does not respect the divisions that we normally take, by which we normally narrate the history of the 60s and 70s. So that is to take the questioning of genre and medium and discipline that the artists did in that time very seriously, and to attempt to look on the one hand, with the same type of rigor, historical rigor that we associate with art history, but yet at the same time, on the other hand, with the type of latitude that visual culture has allowed us to look at, although keeping these notions of intentionality, meaning, and ultimately, I hope, importance of the artworks or film works or whatever they happen to be. What I'd like to begin with, though, is to show the work that I'm going to be circling around today. It takes about 12 minutes to show, and I can do it straight from here. And so I'll start with that. And the sound has to be up on the computer in the back. So that needs to be on because it's already making noise.
Seven divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 3 divided by 4 times 7 divided by 8 times 2. Well, that's the way it goes. Actually, it's kind of too bad because this one is basically, let's see, if you want to get the answer on it, it's well, you have to put in an extra factor of 3 at the end, but it's 3 times 7 is 21, you know, and then it's 21 to the 24th, which you can easily calculate. This is 21 to the 2 to the 4 to the 8 12, 16, 20, 24, which is that's a pretty humongous number. Then, as I say, times 3, and then you have to divide this by several powers of 2. In fact, you have to divide by about 120 powers of 2. So divide by, oh, I lost it. Forget it. Okay, this one is called 3 to 4 times 7 to the minus 19th, and it's a very nice one. I really like this one. 1 divided by 4 times 3 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 divided by 4 times 8 divided by 7 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 equals 1.0000697. That's a nice short one. Bound to come out okay. And this next one is not. This is 3 to the 75th. Times 10 to the 7 to the minus 37th. And this is about the longest, well, this is one of the longer ones, but it's one of the nicer ones too. And it goes like this. 3, well, let's start off with 1.0000. And our cycle come back to there, times 3. Some of these get pretty good. Times 3 divided by 7. Times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 7 times 3 times 2 times 3. 1.0000242. I'm not going to get any better than that, but I do want to throw in one other number, one time only, 13. And that's the only time we're going to let 13 in. But we'll keep 7, and we'll keep 3, and we'll still divide by 2. And this one goes like this. Times 7 divided by 8 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 times 3 divided by 2 times 7 divided by 8 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 times 3 divided by 2 times 7 divided by 8 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 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 2. I forgot one more time. Times 7 divided by 8 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 times 7 divided by 8. Wow! Oh, times 3 divided by 2. There, we got it at last anyway. 1.0000161. And that one is kind of nice. I wouldn't mind running through that one again. Let's see if I can do it very nicely, because I like the 13 in there. 7 times 3 divided by 2 times 7 divided by 8 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 times 7 divided by 8. You notice that cycle of 13 coming back again. Times 3 divided by 2 times 7 divided by 8 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 times 3 divided by 2 times 7 divided by 8 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 times 3 divided by 2 times 3 divided by 2. I forgot that one again. Times 7 divided by 8 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 times 3 divided by 2. There it is back again. Of course, you can run all these cycles backwards and come out where they were. But the calculator doesn't have the capacity to contain the numbers of the size that are being used here.
Okay. I always like to start off with that because I figure if people can watch 12 minutes of a calculator, then anything I say after that will be more interesting. So we can go. Okay, and I'll just start. In A Voyage on the North Sea, a small but important book that opened the new millennium, Rosalind Krauss portrayed the advent of video in the 1960s as the harbinger of, as put by the book's subtitle, a post-medium condition. The televisual effect of the introduction of the Sony Portapak, she declared, was to shatter the modernist dream of a totalizing medium specificity. The fact of the matter, she wrote, is that television and video seem hydra-headed, existing in endlessly diverse forms, spaces, and temporalities, from which no single instance seems to provide a formal unity for the whole. For even if video had a distinct technical support, its own apparatus, so to speak, she continued, it occupied a kind of discursive chaos, a heterogeneity of activities that could not be theorized as coherent or conceived of as having something like an essence or unifying core. Krauss's understanding of video is aligned with her more general opposition to the rise of intermedia arts. In this, her argument not only continues a long-held critical position, advanced most clearly by Annette Michelson in 1966 in Film and the Radical Aspiration, but accurately reflects the historical conditions of video's emergence within the realm of art. For in contexts as diverse as Sheldon Renan's modest book, Introduction to the American Underground Film of 1967, or Stuart Krantz's elephantine and redundantly titled Science and Technology in the Arts, A Tour Through the Realm of Science and Art of 1974, video first emerged not as a distinct medium or apparatus, but as one part of a much wider and more disparate array of practices, including intermedia, expanded cinema, mixed media, art and technology, World's Fair spectacles, and environmental art, illusion, and simulation. Nevertheless, and despite, I want to stress, the importance of Krauss's overall thesis, Krauss's perspective is ultimately rooted less in history than in the influential theory of postmodernism put forth by Frederick Jameson. In the essay Video, Surrealism Without the Unconscious, Jameson posited that video, rigorously coterminous to his mind with the rise of postmodernism, had eclipsed the quintessentially modernist film to become the predominant medium and art form of the age. Accordingly, for most of his essay, Jameson doggedly pursues a strict analogy between video and the uncontrollable, prolix, and ultimately meaningless flow of images that formed his signature idea of postmodernism. Quote, that pure and random play of signifiers that we call postmodernism, which no longer produced monumental works of the modernist type, but ceaselessly reshuffles the fragments of pre-existent texts. Indeed, Jameson holds to this perspective to such a degree that it not only motivates, even overdetermines his choice of example, Alien Nation, by students of the Art Institute of Chicago, but itself becomes an ideology, as he refuses any distinction between video texts. Never perhaps does Jameson come so close to sounding like Jean Baudrillard as he does at this moment. It is this understanding of video as an analog of the incessant visual equivalency of postmodernism that Krauss deploys to her own ends in A Voyage on the North Sea. Although this perspective is, for Jameson, predominant, two lesser-noted observations from his article open onto somewhat different perspectives or trajectories. The first is the surprising argument or assumption, contrary, by the way, to Krauss, that experimental video represents the whole or totality of video practices, within which broadcast television is but a restricted, albeit privileged, case. Released from all conventional constraints, experimental video, Jameson argues, allows us to witness the full range of possibilities and potentialities of the medium in a way which illuminates its various more restricted uses, the latter, including broadcast television, being subsets and special cases of the form, end quote. The second observation, most surprising perhaps because it comes from Jameson rather than Jonathan Crary, is that video, even or especially in its supposed state of untheorizability and complete heterogeneity, forms part of an overall mechanism of perception and subject formation. The machine on both sides, then, Jameson writes, the machine as subject and object, alike and indifferently. The helpless spectators of video time are as immobilized and technically integrated and neutralized as the older photographic subjects who became, for a time, during the period of long photographic exposures, part of the technology of the medium. The living room, to be sure, or even the relaxed informality of the video museum seems an unlikely place for this assimilation of human subjects to the technological. Yet a voluntary attention is demanded by the total flow of the video text in time, which is scarcely relaxed at all. I have the feeling that mechanical depersonalization, or decentering of the subject, goes even further than in film, in the new medium, where auteurs themselves are dissolved along with the spectator. That's the end of the quote. This overall mechanism that is video, Jameson goes on to argue, is both symptomatic and explanatory of the wider transformations of the most recent stage of capitalist development. If we are willing to entertain the hypothesis that capitalism can be periodized by the quantum leaps or technological mutations by which it responds to its deepest systemic crises, Jameson explains, then it may become a little clearer why and how video, so closely related to the dominant computer and information technology of the late or third stage of capitalism, has a powerful claim for being the art form par excellence of late capitalism. And again, that's a quote from Jameson. Now, that capitalism can be periodized in such a manner, I would contend, is true. Yet to conceive of video as par excellence the defining art form of the third stage of capitalist development is to effect a reification that separates it from the heterogeneous historical and technological contingencies that both defined its development and marked its entry into the realm of art. It is, in fact, to effect precisely the same isolation and exaltation that another Marxist theorist and practicing video artist, Martha Rosler, so insightfully critiqued in her article, Video, Shedding the Utopian Moment of 1985. In this essay, as is well known, Rosler called for a social, rather than art, history of video, one that would not only not, quote, separate out something called video art from the other ways that people, including artists, are attempting to work with video technologies, end quote, but that would also take into account video's relation to the very range and diversity of contemporary and historical practices and technologies out of which it arose. While I agree with Rosler's analysis of the art world's annexation of video as a traditional art form, it is important to note the persistence within her argument of a form-content divide. Video's content was available for ideological reformulation by progressive artists and video collectives, while manipulations of form resided on the side of art, myth, and the museum. It is from within the nexus formed by the very different perspectives of Jameson and Rosler that Tony Conrad's modest first videotape, Cycles of Threes and Sevens from 1977, begins to reveal its interest. Essential for any approach to its content are the particular circumstances of its production. Cycles of Threes and Sevens was made in the context of Conrad's visits to the Media Study Department at Buffalo, New York, where he would later be employed beginning in 1979. As recently evinced by the large exhibition at the ZKM in Karlsruhe, Germany, Buffalo was, for a time, the veritable center of avant-garde image production, with faculty that included Paul Scherritz, Hollis Frampton, Peter Weibel, and Steina and Woody Vasulka, among others. The really hairy guy in there is actually Tony Conrad. And it was in dialogue with the Vasulkas, primarily, that Conrad's first video was produced. Although Rosler does not mention their work, the Vasulkas, consistently ranked in the literature alongside Namjoon Paik and Bill Viola as masters of image-processed video, would doubtlessly figure on the formalist side of her critique. This had not always been the case. The Vasulkas' earliest body of video, the so-called raw tapes, is filled with more or less documentary recordings of the New York underground and countercultural scene. From rock and roll to Warhol's Factory to radical queer theater to political events. Indeed, an urgent letter from the international section of the then Algerian exiled Black Panther Party on March 16, 1971, finds none other than Eldridge Cleaver asking the Vasulkas for a copy of their tape, Nixon's Speech, for use in the Black Panthers' own fledgling videotape program. Within the art world, however, the Vasulkas were progressively assimilated to a type of formal experimentation that continued the developments of abstract painting and op art. For their part, the Vasulkas saw their work as, if not a dialectic, a relation between formal results, which they tended not to stress, and machinic processes. As their aesthetics developed, Woody was led to a certain didacticism, an examination of the visual components from which a new video art could be created, while Steina began to investigate non-anthropocentric forms of perception in installations of, quote, all vision and machine vision. Both projects reincarnated aspects of older modernist dreams, of a universal visual language on the one hand, and of something akin to the camera or kino eye of Ossip Brick or Ziga Vertov by way of Michael Snow's La Région Centrale on the other. By 1977, however, both Stena and Woody had moved beyond video as such toward an engagement with the computer. Manipulation of underlying code would now take precedence over visual image. The basis of the new modality would be the ALU, or arithmetic logic unit, which was not primarily a mechanism of image production, but a Boolean logic operator that could nonetheless be programmed to create a precise range of visual imagery. This was a break, but it was also a continuity, as Woody Vasulka moved once again to create a didactic, universal visual language for the new device. Conrad could not but have felt, in the endeavors of his future colleagues, a certain déjà vu. For, trained in digital computer programming since the 1950s, Conrad had discussed the possibilities and conditions of computerized, quote, electronic film as early as February 1967, noting, what is perfectly obvious to us now, but only entering into the consciousness of artists such as the Vasulkas a decade later, quote, in the microstructure of dot arrays, numerical relationships, i.e. code, might evolve as the most dominant influence, since the dots themselves would inherently have to be dealt with discretely. That's a Conrad quote. Conrad's reaction, however, was not to follow the Vasulkas, but rather to take up, for the first time, video, which suddenly appeared no longer as the future of artistic production, but already as an outdated, if not outmoded, visual and cultural form. In cycles of 3s and 7s, Conrad's video camera was reduced, as it was in much early video, to a static, fixed-frame device of unedited real time. Although the recording and presentation of real time has been theorized, for instance by Frederick Jameson, as one of the keys to video as an art form, Conrad was not in search of medium specificity, which is, of course, an available artistic response to any outmoded device or procedure. Unlike Hollis Frampton, who argued in that same year, 1977, for the medium specificity of both video and film, Conrad always proved resistant to such ideals. Indeed, 3 years before, Conrad's film Feedback had already sought to invalidate the claims that video makers and Hollis Frampton had made on behalf of feedback as the defining aspect of video's medium specificity. Through an intricate and lugubrious procedure, Conrad and his students at Antioch, where he had followed Paul Schertz, produced an instantaneous feedback effect with a purely filmic apparatus. This is a fascinating project that I won't be able to talk about much more here, but we could talk about it at the end if you wanted to. Now, in cycles of 3s and 7s, Conrad would do something related but different. He trained his video camera onto a simple desktop calculator, which served as a surrogate for the computer to which the Vasulkas were now dedicated. Here, however, the function of the device was even further deturned or transformed. For Conrad's calculator was used to compute not the algorithms necessary for the production of electronic film, the, quote, computer instrument subroutines which will, as Conrad himself put it in 1967, produce general control over large assemblages of dots, but rather he used the computer to make the arithmetical reductions involved in deriving a just intonation musical scale based on the harmonic ratios of 3s and 7s, as opposed to the 3s and 5s of conventional Western harmony, which Conrad had explored with Lamont Young, John Cale, and Marian Zazila in the Theater of Eternal Music between 1962 and 1965. In its very setup, then, cycles of 3s and 7s established video as a heterogeneous imbrication of interacting technologies, medias, and/or modes. At its most reduced, perhaps, it presented video art as a strange sort of computer music. And all of these concerns were brought together without the type of self-reflection onto the medium that defined modernist arts, and as was being pursued by the Vasulkas. Indeed, all of these concerns predated Conrad's adoption of video by almost a decade, not just in his written reflections on electronic film, but also in his first movie, The Flicker, made in 1965-66, entirely out of alternating black and white frames. Now, although The Flicker is most known as a modernist structural film, precisely what Rosalind Krauss, like Hollis Frampton, would oppose to the advent of video, Conrad's notebooks of the time situate The Flicker within that much broader soup of intermedia practices from which video actually arose. Television, tape loops, the telephone, subliminal advertising, ultrasound, and popular intermedia spectacles like Murray the K's famous Brooklyn Disco. In fact, Conrad's earliest pronouncements indicate that he considered The Flicker not a medium-specific film at all, but rather an application of strobe, as in a strobe light. And if, as he told Toby Mussman, quote, "the possibilities of what I believe is an entirely new medium seem unlimited," it was because intermittent light, which is, of course, in essence binary code, proved inherently polymorphous. In the end, The Flicker was but one possible realization of Conrad's ideas as recorded in his notebooks. Alternatives included a neon hula hoop, eyelid light environment simulators that would flash directly onto closed eyes, and devices for oral and visual EEG feedback to induce, quote, "a convulsive, quasi-epileptic seizure that could be used to replace electric shock treatment therapy." Once completed, Conrad afforded The Flicker little sanctity as a film either. He noted how it could be viewed, even most effectively, with eyes closed, as well as how the strobe drew attention from the screen, filling the theater, quote, "like a swimming pool." He even endorsed a viewing position not toward the screen, but rather watching the audience as a screen, a feature he explored in an installation-like showing that projected the film onto one half of the audience, who were wearing frosted plastic glasses, subjecting them to a direct dose of flicker while the other half of the audience observed them. As such a configuration makes clear, the primary receptor of strobe is not the screen, but the viewing subject. There is a variety of effects that I am investigating, Conrad noted, effects that act on your eyes so as to produce the actual imagery directly within the observer, rather than in a normal way of having the eye interpret the light patterns on the screen. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze, in a short but insightful passage from Cinema 2, noted that The Flicker helped mark the inauguration of a third epoch in film, a, quote, "cinema of expansion without camera, and also without screen or film stock, a cinema in which, quote, anything can be used as a screen, the body of a protagonist or even the bodies of the spectators. Anything can replace the film stock in a virtual film which now only goes on in the head, behind the pupils," end quote. This third epoch, Deleuze noted, was related not just to what we would call expanded cinema, but also and specifically to, quote, "the electronic image," that is, the tele and video image, the numerical image coming into being, which either had to transform cinema or to replace it, to mark its death, end quote. Now, at this point, I would like to digress for more than a moment to address Deleuze's third epoch, which is coterminous with both The Flicker and the advent of video. This third epoch, as I will argue, not only encompasses that intermedia stew surrounding video's birth, but also marks the transformation that Jameson saw as the third stage of capitalism. To do so, we need to turn even further from video, and even for a moment from Conrad, toward the seemingly disparate development of Brian Gysin and Ian Somerville's Dream Machine of 1960. Although often understood in aestheticizing, mystical contexts, the Dream Machine was actually born of writer William S. Burroughs' ideas about control, ideas which underlie much of Deleuze's thoughts about video, television, and the era of control. Control, famously for Burroughs, was the effect of a virus that resided within the central nervous system, manipulating speech centers, throat muscles, and vocal cords. The symbiosis of virus and host resulted in a series of association lines of speech, thought, and behavior that tended towards standardization, the establishment and enforcement of a norm. Communication was thus understood as a power relation through which the virus sought to replicate itself at the point of reception. Although Burroughs's virus resonated primarily through semiotic networks, it also worked on the central nervous system directly, bypassing language via techniques like subliminal and waking suggestion. And it could also, apparently, be propagated through light. As Burroughs noted, quote, "Change is a function of number, and today, in the electronic age, our only interesting constant is 186,000 miles per second, the speed of light, which the speed of electricity does not reach, let alone surpass." The ultimate threat, as Ian Somerville contended, was that, quote, "films and TV impose external rhythms on the mind, altering the brainwaves, which are otherwise as individual as fingerprints. It is entirely possible that the EEG records of a generation of TV watchers," he continued, "will be similar, even identical, although differing from those which present research reveals." Although tinged with both technological determinism and paranoia, Somerville's proposition can be read as a symptom of the transformation from a regime of spectacle into what Jonathan Crary has described as, quote, "another network in which what is at stake is no longer representation, but distribution and regulation." Burroughs, Geisen, and Somerville all drew their understanding of strobe from the book The Living Brain by British neurophysiologist W. Gray Walter. However, despite the futurism with which Gray Walter generally described his work, the inventors of the dream machine sought to defend against the specter of impending neurophysiological regulation by recovering an outmoded technology. For as is evident in its earliest version, the dream machine is essentially a zoetrope, a 19th century optical device modified so that, like a magic lantern, or more proximately video or television, its main light source emanates from within. Like a zoetrope, the dream machine permits unlimited interaction, allowing viewers to exceed normative regulation and enter states of fatigue approximating hypnosis or visual breakdown. Later versions of the dream machine also allowed for modulation through multiple speeds, as several layers of openings were calibrated to different strobe rates. In this, the dream machine paralleled the group's wider experiments with media technologies, where processes like tape recording were also modulated to states beyond the norm. Speeding up, slowing down, inverting or inching recorded words or phrases aimed to decondition imposed or inherited association locks. If control, or as engineers say, negative feedback, is the key to power in this century, Friedrich Kittler, the media theorist, has written about these experiments, then fighting that power requires positive feedback. Create endless feedback loops until VHF or stereo, tape deck or scrambler, the whole array of World War Army equipment produces wild oscillations. That's the end of Kittler's quote. The most famous of the group's strategies was, of course, the cut-up, random film or tape splicings that, like their literary counterpart, sought to sever automatic reactions and intervene in the process of thinking. Like a moving film, noted Burroughs, the flow of thought seems to be continuous, while actually the thoughts flow, stop, change, and flow again. At the point where one flow stops, there is a split-second hiatus. The new way of thinking grows in the hiatus between thoughts. Now, in Burroughs' analogy with film, this split-second hiatus refers to the discontinuity within film projection, the interstice between frames that allows for the imposition of a cut. Whereas cinema normally uses the cut to produce continuity through unitary diegesis or more dialectical montage, Burroughs' interstice dissociates itself from the material on either side. It functions very precisely as what Deleuze termed an irrational cut, opening onto an irreducible difference or fissure between associations. It is not a matter of following a chain of images, even across voids, notes Deleuze, but of getting out of the chain or the association. Now, if in the 19th century the zoetrope's most salient feature was the blurring of individual images into an illusion of continuous motion, by the mid-20th it was almost certainly the opposite. The relative cutting or disarticulation effected upon the visual flow by the dream machine. The dream machine further augmented such cuts by shining its light through them. Although the dream machine was intended to induce experience, much like film and television, it was to do so not in order to reinforce the norm, but, quote, to accommodate the maximum range of our alpha rhythms, thereby projecting against such regulation. As a tool for counter-conditioning, Geisen imagined the dream machine as destined for, quote, every suburban home in the spot formerly occupied by the television set. Now, Tony Conrad was well acquainted with the effects of flickering light, having experimented with it since 1963 in the elaborate fantasy sessions directed by his friend, the filmmaker Jack Smith. Although Conrad subsequently became aware of the dream machine and even consulted and read Burroughs' ideas about flicker while working on his film, he felt little compulsion to investigate it very much because he immediately recognized the roots of their thinking in the work of W. Gray Walter, whose writings he had encountered as an undergraduate at Harvard. Now, sharing a common genealogy, that is, in the work of Gray Walter, the flicker and the dream machine, in fact, operate according to very similar principles. The flicker, too, primarily deployed the cut as an anti-representational, disarticulating device. This was noted by Deleuze. Quote, the black or white screen stands for the outside of all the images when the flickerings multiply the interstices like irrational cuts. The flicker also allowed for modulation through a variety of non-normative states. This was to occur not only on the horizontal level of the films running through different patterns, but on a vertical level as well. Conrad modulated the mechanism's projection rate of 24 frames per second by structuring his film to provide up to 3 different layers of photic driving. Due to the ambiguities of frequency or of harmonic relationships, Conrad explained, quote, there are many patterns in the film which suggest alternative interpretations in terms of frequency. This ambiguity, I'm still quoting, interests me because it allows you to see the film on a number of different levels. Instead of a regular off-on pattern, one particular pattern can suggest up to 3 visual interpretations at the same time. The actual levels of interpretation are at this time rather obscure because we don't know exactly how the flicker affects the mind, which seems to be partly through the eye and partly through the brain. That is, the brain or eye can respond to one or more patterns at the same time, end quote. Conrad's clicking electronic soundtrack to the flicker similarly hovered on the threshold between pitch and rhythm, complementing the visual harmonics and adding further layers of associative reception. Now, in a note to himself in his notebooks, provocatively dated May 1968, Conrad observed that, quote, virtually any structured function can now be machine programmed from TV, jotting next to it the designation, quote, 21st century. His reference would seem to be to the commutability of information, a translatability from one medium to another that theorists from Marshall McLuhan to Paul Virilio have seen as the hallmark of electronic media. From its inception, however, the flicker proved at odds with the inherent machine programming of television. That is, it can't be reproduced on video and it cannot be shown on television. Now, this is a historical point and perhaps a contingent one. However, if following Burroughs, television can be considered one site, even an illusory one, of the emerging forces of micropolitical perceptual regulation, then the flicker, like the dream machine, figures as somehow counter to that site, differing on a base level as well as on the various higher levels of harmonic interaction to which it attains. It is here, perhaps, that Conrad's project, in the flicker, may be understood to defend against the type of perceptual regulation similar to that opposed by the circle around Burroughs. But whereas the dream machine pitted an updated 19th century device against the 20th century forms of cinema and television, the significant opposition for Conrad seems to have been between cinema, which he saw as outmoded, and a 21st century era of TV. Support for such a reading can be found in Conrad's little-known second film, the first version of The Eye of Count Flickerstein from 1966, which he re-edited and released 2 years before he made his first video in 1975. Now, that is The Eye of Count Flickerstein, was initially integrally related to the flicker. The stock for both films was shot and developed at the same time, and a bit of flicker footage was even spliced into the second film. And it was in the context of making The Eye of Count Flickerstein that Conrad set down his thoughts about electronic film that I quoted above. Now, in film and television are explicitly set at cross purposes. After a handmade title sequence, you see here part of it, and an image of the count, it consists of nothing but static, filmed from a TV set aligned at a 90-degree angle to the camera. So this is what most of the film is here. Without input or image, static is, in some sense, television as pure medium. According to the teleology put forth by Marshall McLuhan, older media seamlessly should become the content of later, presumably more advanced ones. In Eye of Count Flickerstein, however, precisely like Cycles of Threes and Sevens 10 years later, Conrad reversed this situation, putting the newer technology under the unblinking gaze of an older technology that, in this case, through the film's references to artisanal production and to the classic horror movies beloved by Jack Smith, Conrad codes as outmoded. The interference produced by this reverse remediation leads the otherwise homogeneous flow of television static to waver or break apart, to create swirling visual spaces and subtle abstract patterns. Though the result was rather decorative in the end, Conrad's original intention seems to have been much more oppositional. As he recorded the idea behind Eye of Count Flickerstein in his notebook, quote, "Film an out-of-town TV station with sound, photograph sideways to destroy TV appearance." Now, it is perhaps worth noting that there is another intertextual reference embedded in Conrad's titles. The Eye of title card, toward which Conrad's camera zooms until the human eye peering through the O of the of fills the frame and then cuts to static, was conceived by Conrad as an explicit retort to the famous title sequence of Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, the title sequence which was done by Saul Bass and John Whitney. By 1967, John Whitney, of course, had gone on to formulate an impressive type of electronic film through the use of elaborate computer equipment, a type of visual music that continued the previous century's symbolist and mystical modernist aspirations. Conrad's electronic film, by contrast, is a confrontation, rather than synthesis, of technologies and an engagement not with the future possibilities of computerization, but with a technology already existing and rapidly becoming hegemonic, that is TV. And indeed, if we approach the Eye of Count Flickerstein from a Burroughsian perspective, in which television is only the most visible site of an emerging network of distribution and regulation, then it may be seen to complement Police Car, also known as Police Lights, a little-known Flux film made in the same year by Conrad's musical collaborator and roommate, John Cale. Trained on one and then two flashing blue lights like those of a police cruiser, Police Car puts the aesthetic of so-called structural film into a dialogue with certain operations of power. Now, unlike the flicker did not attempt to depict a relation to power, even as an abstract or allegorical interference between film and television. Nonetheless, it can be understood to manifest such an opposition by transforming the movie theater into an immersive environmental mechanism of heterotopic stimulation. As though to counter the type of uniformity Burroughs and his associates feared, the flicker connects the viewer to a counter-hegemonic device that provides a different pace, rhythm, temporality, and layering of perceptual stimuli, deturning or deterritorializing contemporary training and attentive norms in a manner that, as Jameson put it, is hardly relaxed at all. Now, we must make one more detour before returning to video as such, to another confrontation of film and the computer. When the Cinephone Theatre in London showed Anthony Balch's film The Cut-Ups, which was made in collaboration with William Burroughs, Brian Geisen, and Ian Somerville in 1967, a machine could be found in the lobby purporting to grant access to the interplanetary agency, Control. It had been manufactured and programmed by a suspect pair named Willie Deitch and Brenda Dunks, whom Anthony Balch described as, quote, two would-be, once were, computer operators with IBM who now function on their own, question mark. Through the machine, and at a cost of some 12 shillings per session, you could pose questions and appropriate follow-ups to be relayed to Control via IBM's offices in Seattle. At the time, Balch, Burroughs, and the others submitted numerous inquiries. A typical session went as follows. Question: what is Word? Answer: Word is ETC. What does ETC mean? Electrical time control. What is virus? Virus is B. What is the relation between Word and virus? Power. That's an actual transcript from the Control archives. Now, years later, Brian Geisen came to question the machine's effectiveness, noting the suspiciously circular nature of its responses. The answers were interesting and essentially seemed pertinent, not Sibylline or Delphic, he explained. However, these answers, I'm quoting him, were perhaps fed in by the questions themselves, as I think one might judge from a study, a complete study, of all the questions submitted and all the answers given by Control, end quote. In the end, Brian Geisen likened Deitch's and Dunk's computer to a sleight of hand routine, an automated carnival trick or parlor game. Yet as a closed-loop feedback system, no matter how primitive or absurd, Deitch's and Dunk's machine emulated an important component of the contemporary functioning of power. For as James R. Benninger has shown, the Control revolution, which had its roots in the 19th century, instituted various modes of mass feedback by which individuals' ideas and desires could be harnessed, incorporated, and ultimately directed to maximize monetary or political returns. From opinion polls, which arose in the 19th century, to directed advertising, which arose at that time as well, Control, according to Benninger, is a continuous process of the extraction, regulation, and feedback of information for the purposes of production, capitalization, and profit. Benninger argues that the, quote, basic societal transformation from industrial to information society had essentially been completed by the late 1930s, end quote, a date which, perhaps not unimportantly, coincided with television's public debut. Thus, while the underlying conditions of Control may already have been established, television, understood not only as a perceptual technology, but as the overall regulatory system that includes advertising, opinion polls, and Nielsen ratings, not to mention more recent information gathering devices, such as in the States, TiVo, television arose as part of this new social machine's ascension to hegemony. And it is within the larger social and technological network or assemblage of Control that TV would come to act in what Deleuze called its, quote, social function, as, quote, social engineering in its purest form. Ultimately, such control would be exercised not merely statistically, but through and upon apparently internal forces. I am controlled by control, declared Geisen, because I am controlled by my body. And for Geisen and his associates enthralled with the work of W. Gray Walter, the locus of this control, or one of them, as it extended to mental and perceptual activities, was none other than the brain's alpha waves, those which proved particularly susceptible to the impact of flickering light. We are programmed, Geisen continued. If indeed there is such a thing as the alpha band, which is now perceptible, has been for the last 30 years since the invention of the electroencephalogram, this is Geisen, we may presume that this is a program. And if there is a program, there must be a programmer. And the programmer would seem to be control, end quote. Now this is, to some extent, a science fiction story. But although Burroughs often presented the human subject's implication in control as a timeless phenomenon, it was in fact strictly historical. For while the commercial and statistical aspects of control may have developed in the 19th century, control of the individual on a bodily level, the integration of the human into a human-machine feedback loop, would be developed only during the Second World War. Technologies such as artillery firing directors, articulated guns, and pip-matching radar controls, before cybernetics, integrated living soldiers into proto-cybernetic devices to correct and or amplify one part of the machine's output for input into another of its components. The operators within such assemblages, explains the historian of science David Mendel, quote, worked like human servo mechanisms, distinguishing signals from noise, smoothing and renewing the signals before sending them to the next stage, end quote. Such individuals' mental and perceptual capabilities, the very neurological relays between body and brain, were integrated into a system of continuous control, in which, as Harold Hazan's 1934 theory of servo mechanisms defined it, quote, the restoring force, active continually on the output element, is approximately proportional to the deviation of the output. Research in these areas would later be extended to areas inside the human brain, in the sometimes quixotic attempts by the military and the CIA to produce a perfectly controllable individual, the apocryphal Manchurian Candidate. And it was through such channels, of course, that both strobe, the technological substrate of so much intermedia, and hallucinogenic pharmaceuticals, that is LSD, intermedia's chemical counterpart, would be introduced in the name of science into the culture at large. Now, by now, we have deviated quite far from the subject of a single videotape. My intention, however, was to begin to understand how the flicker, the Eye of Count Flickerstein, and no doubt many more works arising from this vast intermedia soup comprising art, science, psychedelia, and early video can be understood as implicated within a whole series of social, historical, technological, and economic transformations. The human servo mechanism, the subject implicated in a wider network of systems of continuous control, I want to argue, is none other than the, quote, assimilation of human subjects to the technological that Jameson saw taking place in living rooms and video museums, although he only theorized the two-dimensional flow of images across the screen. And as I have tried to indicate, it is against such a mechanism that Conrad Burroughs and others attempted to refunction the very technologies of control, video being only one of them. Now, in 1977, with cycles of 3s and 7s, Tony Conrad returned not only to make an electronic film and to the adoption of video, but to the larger questions initially posed by the flicker. In an article of that year, that is 1977, entitled A Few Remarks Before I Begin, Conrad proposed that the largely unacknowledged effect and function of both film and video was that of regulating attentiveness. Critiquing media theory's then nearly exclusive reliance on semiotics, Conrad contended, quote, the film scholar has never been up to dealing efficaciously with the problem of anticipation, suspense, and temporal composition. It was nevertheless fundamental to his mind that, quote, people respond with their attention in ways which can be programmed, end quote. Conrad was at this point no longer interested in ideas of direct neurophysiological transformation, as he was in the flicker, no longer viewing or pursuing formal transformations as inherently oppositional. He had, to use Martha Rosler's terms, shed the utopian moment, even criticizing his earlier position as neoclassical. Hence, no doubt, the ironically deflating, almost desultory nature of his computer video, cycles of 3s and 7s. He did not entirely turn back on his earlier interests, however. The very goal of cycles of 3s and 7s was to display the effects of media programming, what Conrad began to call at this time in other articles, ideology engineering, the patterned feedback mechanisms of attentiveness by which communication and control interact. Indeed, what one takes from the video depiction of Conrad's repeated run-throughs of mathematical reductions is not so much information about complex harmonic ratios, but something more akin to what he called the temporal composition of a musical work itself. Conrad's repeated times 7 divided by 3 times 7 divided by 3 times 7 divided by 3 times 3 divided by 2 catches in the mind unshakably, not unlike the refrain of a popular song. And indeed, I've talked to Conrad and he said that that's exactly what he was trying to do, is to make these numbers stay in your head like something you'd hear on the radio. At the same time, as the final part of the segment that I showed makes clear, Conrad invokes something like a degree zero of mainstream narrative, much like that invoked in a different manner by Terry Fox's children's tapes of 1974, if you know that video. The patterns of anticipation and resolution, which are incipient in the Common Practice program, have something going for them, Conrad noted in a few remarks. And as he encounters, that is, in his calculations, as he encounters and overcomes calculating mistakes to arrive at the desired result, which is always 1, this is precisely what he pursues. And the absurd suspense of the video, of course, is particularly highlighted when he decides to run through one of his favorite calculations a second time and makes, again, the same mistake and then finally comes to it. Thus, and this is the very end, Conrad's modest first video not only imbricates video with other modes, mediums, and technological devices, but also interconnects via the interface of attention the two halves of video, content and form, to reveal the effectiveness of formal manipulations in engineering one's ideology. Conrad would conclude his article, and I will conclude my talk, with a statement, the ambiguity of which is directly to the point. Conrad stated in a few remarks before I begin, the very last line, quote, "Attention needs guideposts for focus. Exploration of alternative attentiveness is a valuable cultural commodity." And that's the end.
Bien, pues muchísimas gracias. Tenemos ahora un turno para preguntas, cuestiones y sugerencias, así es que el tiempo es vuestro.
Well, I'll ask you in English and I'll let the translator translate.
Okay.
All right, and that'll be faster for everybody. Well, thank you very much for an astonishing reconstruction of this early moment in video, and particularly of Tony Conrad's, a moment in Tony Conrad's career. I was wondering, I sort of missed the mention of minimal music, especially because of the cycles of 3s and 5s and 3s and 7s. Sorry, and the whole other intertext of minimal variation and repetition and so on, and also perhaps the mention. I mean, again, this would have gone on till midnight or something, but I was just wondering why you privileged these particular intertexts as opposed to, for example, other, the musical intertext, noise itself, because both the eye of Count Flickerstein with the use of static itself is absolute noise. I mean, total noise, no signal, and the use of noise in the Cagean musical paradigm and so on.
Oh, sorry. Noise would be a very good one to deal with Eye of Count Flickerstein. You're absolutely right. I mean, the Eye of Count Flickerstein, which was only ever shown one time in that version with the Jack Smith-esque stuff at the beginning, really is the lost counterpart to the flicker. And so you're absolutely right. You could say the flicker is all about structure, which when it's shown creates noise in your brain, because when you look at the flicker, what happens is you get all sorts of like colors and after images and all sorts of weird, stuff happens in your brain, basically. Whereas the Eye of Count Flickerstein is exactly the opposite. It's the pure noise. You're absolutely right about static, that because of the way it interferes with the film mechanism itself, actually creates pattern. So it creates momentary bit waves that happen actually, that goes like this, basically, because the television's turned sideways. So it's scanning like this, and then it's being caught in various moments. So it's being caught at a different place. And so what it does is it makes this almost a pattern, right? And then there's various cuts. So you're absolutely right that those two, that you could do that, noise and pattern, and talk about those things. Now with cycles of 3s and 7s, Conrad, in terms of the relationship to minimal music, is doing something a bit different, which is also sort of interesting. This is now 1977. Conrad's form of minimalism, and Conrad is an astonishing figure that I began to write an article about and just completed a 330-page book about. And this is the kind of thing that you just keep sort of going. So Conrad, for people that don't know, as I showed, I can go all the way back to this, was in the original group of minimal music, which was the Theater of Eternal Music with Lamont Young and John Cale, who later goes on to be in the Velvet Underground. And they never recorded at the time and never released anything. By 1977, of course, we have minimal music as perhaps the biggest thing in classical music, but a different type of minimal music, a type of minimal music which is rhythmic, like Terry Riley or Steve Reich or Phil Glass. This is harmonic. This is just one tone sustained for about 5 hours. And so what Conrad is doing is he's making a sort of minimal music in a way, because he's running through a process exactly like Steve Reich would run through a process, like take these variables and then decline the variables by these cycles by which you reduce the scale down to that. But he's doing it in reference to his harmonic music, which was based upon a scale of 3 and 7 rather than 3 and 5. So the intertexts in Conrad's work, both thematically and technologically, are always quite complex and always do this thing which interests me a lot in the case of Conrad, but interests me now a lot in general, which is the further you get into the work, when you get to the origin is always not part of the work. It's an absolutely 100% Foucauldian type of genealogy, which is that at the origin is never the same. The origin is always different. So at the origin of the video work is the computer. And in the computer, it's not about the computer, it's about music. And the music, it's not about the rhythmic music, it's about the harmonic music. It's this sort of mise on a beam structure that goes back, that keeps going back. And the same thing with something like film feedback, where Conrad decided to make a film. I have that here somewhere. Or maybe it's in the back. Where Conrad decided that everybody's talking about, this is it. Where he's talking about everybody is saying, well, video, the thing that's specific to video is feedback. You can get real-time feedback. You can get the image to come back to you. And film, you can't do that. So Conrad sets out to figure a way that you can do that, right? So he does this film feedback, which is much more known than, say, Count Flickerstein, but much less known than the flicker, of, exposing the film and then developing it in a dark room, sliding it under the door, right? Wiping it down. It's actually developed over here. Slid under the door, wiping it down, then projecting it onto a screen, and then getting it again, and then recording it, and then doing it again, right? So it like runs all the way through. And what you get is what you see there on the side, this little bit of actually it's an outtake that he gave me, is you see the screen 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I mean, that's all that it's being done. So, he goes into film to make it do what video does. And of course, then what video is doing with feedback is also something that, say, a guitar can do with feedback, which Conrad had also done. So each of these things is always, it's like through the looking glass of Alice in Wonderland. Everything just keeps going. But I think that happens with a lot of stuff, actually, in this time. I think that we, as art historians, interestingly, don't often engage with the true radicality of the work from, say, 64 to 76. And we tend to privilege, in some terms, we tend to privilege those artists that actually pulled back from that. So we tend to privilege, say, Don Judd, who held very closely to a specific object in between painting and sculpture, but then didn't go any further. And we tend to forget people like Conrad, who are really, really, really pushing the hybridity of their project in a way, so much so that it's almost unrecognizable, I think.
Bueno, yo mi pregunta tenía que ver un poco con una reflexión sobre la tecnología.
I'm not getting it. Sorry.
Ahora. Y es que gran parte de las obras que has mostrado parecen, en ellas parece producirse una especie de colapso de la tecnología, como si la tecnología dejase de ser pues, un medio para un fin y se convirtiese en un fin en sí mismo. Como si se nos hiciese consciente de la propia tecnología. Y en ese sentido me recordaba a la idea de Heidegger, a la idea heideggeriana de técnica o tecnología. Y como pues, precisamente cuando uno se hace consciente de esa tecnología, la tecnología se vuelve como opaca y hace que deje, bueno, que no sea posible la dominación por parte de esa tecnología. Entonces la pregunta sería, o vendría a ser, ¿hasta qué punto toda esta serie de reflexiones tecnológicas no tienen que ver con un colapso de la tecnología? Y cómo pues, en la actualidad, en ciertas prácticas artísticas contemporáneas, en esas que Hal Foster llama las asíncronas, no se produce también ese colapso de la tecnología y como un medio de evitación o de como una especie de salir del control.
Very good question. Oh, sorry, very good question. There's a lot of technology here that I'm not separated from. To get to there's a lot in that question, obviously. Let me start maybe at the end, and with the discussion of, or the place where it intersects, say, with Hal's discussion of. I need to stop this because I'm hearing myself. It's like driving me nuts. There we go. Okay, I'll put that back in a second. But the notion of the asynchronous. Now, one of the things that I tried to do in this work, or that's motivating this work, and that's also motivated other things, such as when I wrote on Exploding Plastic Inevitable by Warhol, is that, to my mind, when we deal with technology, although we talk about it a lot, there are two possibilities. There's a sort of techno-euphoria, or there's this sort of attempt to get completely outside of technology. Yeah? And so I'm continually want to be in productive dialogue with Rosalind Krauss's A Voyage on the North Sea book, which I think is a very important essay. It's basically a long essay, but which basically puts forward what Hal would call the asynchronous. Yeah? Brutsayers is the asynchronous in that moment. He is seeing the rise of exactly this moment. He's seeing the rise of the Portapac, and his response is to go back into artisanal film. right? Now, the issue, though, with that and with the asynchronous is that the attempt, and this is ultimately, I think, a Frankfurt School phobia, is the attempt to get to a space which is completely uncontaminated. Yeah? So when Krauss or Foster or even Benjamin Buchloh talk about technology and they talk about the outmoded, it's as though the outmoded is within, now that there's the Portapak, film is dead. Now that film is dead, it's not really a technology, and therefore we can work with it, and therefore we can be safe from that. And so Conrad is working with the outmoded too, right? I mean, it's only at the moment that the computer arises that he's interested in video. And it's only at the moment that he thinks that television, like he's foreseeing basically early video. I mean, it's 1966, there is early video, Warhol's worked with video. It's only at the moment of video that he's interested in film, that he makes his first film. Yet he's not within a space that's separated from technology. He's in exactly maybe this Heideggerian space of the sort of messy sort of ness with technology there. So he's completely in the soup of that. And I'm very interested in him and in all types of people that are in that contaminated zone. I'm not very interested in trying to find the good object that is entirely outside of it, because I don't think there is an outside of it. So I'm interested in those people that are symptomatic of it. And so part of what I wanted to do here, or what I'm looking at here, is to deal with all of these really messy things and to get things and make people messy, including Deleuze. Because, we're always talking about, or we always quote, Deleuze's postscript on control societies. It's very nice, very succinct, very seductive, very clear text. But Deleuze's notions of control come ultimately from Burroughs, which come ultimately from these two nutty computer programmers, Willie Deitch and Brenda Dunks, who are doing this sort of parlor game type of thing. So, there's a whole genealogy to these ideas that is completely imbricated in all of these things at the same time. The other thing, just to say one more thing before going back to your question, the other thing that I wanted to sort of intervene in is that we still have, like when people want to go against the notion of the outmoded or to go against the critique of technology that's done, say, by the October group, they turn to, say, somebody like Donna Haraway, and they say, the cyborg is great, and da-da-da-da. And, now we can get free at this, that, and the other. Well, if you go to and Donna Haraway is a very good, writer and engaged in the history of science. She's very optimistic, but still. But if you go through, and this is a sort of incredible book by David Mendel, and look at this early, where cybernetics actually comes from, and the manner in which cybernetics is predicated upon putting human beings into feedback loops that affect their actual perceptual capabilities. Yeah, this is like Jonathan Crary in the 20th century. Then that to me is also very interesting. I mean, those guys are cyborgs, like those things that I showed. Those are like literally cyborgs. These guys are literally in guns, and the only way that these radar systems work or that guns work, because computers just can't do it at that point, is to basically plug into a human being. A human being has to be able to see it, react fast enough to move the lever there over to there in relation to what's being seen on the screen. So they're caught within this cybernetic sort of system. And I think that somebody like Conrad, who was not at all technology phobic, who thought about technology and was not uncritical toward technology, but who was swimming in it at the same time, had a different motivation. And so it was no longer there is a bit of asynchronicity, but I think there's much more of a deterring factor, yeah, to actually attempt to take the relationship with technology, a relationship and not just with technology, but with this wider thing which it comes up, which is actually called control. I mean, you know, the technology of control can simply be somebody knocking on your door and asking you what political party you want to vote for and why, and then feeding that back to the political party, who then targets advertising according to that. That's what James R. Benninger argues. It's a very low tech, but yet it is a form of control that situates and sets up the parameters of the visual culture that we actually ever encounter. And so what Conrad and Burroughs and even W. Gray Walter, I think, are attempting to do is to take that system and almost like try to create a different current, an alternate current. Now, of course, what happens is that it becomes psychedelia in part. And you know, now psychedelia is like cool, but nobody like really takes it completely seriously as a sort of countercultural moment. It sort of discredited itself. But yet some of these proto-cybernetic things, which the flicker is in a way, are very much about attempting to move this sort of relationship with technology. Now, from your perspective, to answer your question short, from your perspective, yeah, Heidegger's critique completely works on these people, and they're completely tied up in these things and can't actually sort of get out of it in a way. And the challenge, of course, is to get in there and swim with them without losing the perspective, you know, to try to have that perspective too. Okay, there we go. Now others? There's no others.
¿Alguna más? Bien, pues si no hay nada más, cerramos el curso, cerramos la ponencia agradeciendo al profesor Branden W su paciencia y cerramos también la programación del CENDEAC en este primer semestre. Las próximas actividades ya comienzan en septiembre con el curso de Arte de Acción y a partir de septiembre a diciembre hay una programación bastante intensa. Así es que muchas gracias a todos.